Hey everybody, and welcome to another video from the Electronic Armory. In this video, we're going to cover Android fragments. Fragments give us the ability to swap out different components of our UI, such as a Google map, so that we can reuse that component in different pieces of our application without having to launch another activity just because we want to show the user some different UI. So to illustrate this, we're going to start off with the template navigation drawer activity. So go ahead and start that off, and we're just going to use the basic defaults. Now, everything has to live in one activity, so all of our fragments are going to be swapped in and out of our main activity. So we always have to have one activity in our Android application so that we can put the fragment or fragments into that activity. Now, if we want to, we can still launch other activities for different UI components, but for this example, we're just going to use one activity. So I'm going to set those defaults, and Gradle is going to build our application for us. Okay, so once we have our application built and ready to start, I'm going to expand these folders just so we have all of our code visible to us. Now, when we start off this application, it doesn't actually give us any fragments to start off with, but what it does give us is a sidebar. And so we can look at the different layouts for this. If we click on our activity main here on the left-hand side, we can see what this application would look like when we launch this application on our device or our emulator. Now, this will start off with an import gallery slideshow tools with some icons. We can go ahead and swap those icons out. However, we can't do it in this view because what this view is actually doing is importing several different views. So if we look at the code for this sidebar here, it's actually not the sidebar. It is an include for the sidebar, which is contained in the app bar main, which is this guy over here on the left-hand side. And then we're also importing widget here, which is going to have the header, which is this thing over here. And then there's a couple other components in there as well. So let's take a look at one of these each individually. So app bar main is going to be the main view that we have, and then inside of that actually there is our content main. So that's what's actually containing the hello world widget here. If we go back here and we try to select that, you can see that it's just a layout, and if we confirm that in the code, you can see that it is simply an include, which includes this layout. So we have a couple different layouts that are nested within each other. So if you're looking for a particular widget, say this floating action bar, well, that floating action bar is in the app bar main as opposed to going to the activity main, which again is our main activity. You can see that button there, but you can never select it. So it is embedded in one of these items here, as is the nav header for that sidebar. So if you're looking at the activity main here, you see there's the header. That's an include, this is an include, etc. So just make sure you're selecting the same file that these are contained in order to manipulate these views. For our purposes, let's go back to our main activity. What we want to do is we want to be able to, when the user taps on import gallery slideshow or tools or whatever it is, we want this view here on the right, i.e. our content main, to change whatever it is. And so if you're going and displaying a gallery, then that would probably be a view that shows a list of images or whatnot, whereas tools might be something like settings or other types of interactions that you do within the application. And so let's go ahead and show you how to change this view using fragments by tapping on one of these things, or you could, any one of these buttons. So those buttons are, there's a handler inside of main activity. So if we scroll down just a bit until we get down to the on navigation item selected, it's going to pass you in a menu item. Now that menu item has an item ID attached to it. And in Kotlin, we use this when methodology here to say when item.item ID, and it's going to be equal to r.id.nav camera. Then go ahead and do this code. And this is where we're going to put in the code that swaps in and out our fragment, which we haven't created yet. But this is very similar to a switch case statement where you have like a switch statement here and then the statement the condition here, and then each case would go here. So it's very similar to that if you're familiar with it. But again, what it's going to do is do a comparison of this item ID to nav camera, nav gallery, nav slideshow, etc. And that's going to be contained in your list here. And so again, in order to find out what the IDs are for each list item here, and in order to find the IDs for this, we're going to go to activity main. And a couple things you can do. If we go back to the design real quick, you can see that there is the outline section here that I currently have selected. This is our nav view. And if I double click on that, it'll bring me to that layout where I can then go and see the nav camera and its ID for that item, as well as the gallery, the slideshow, etc. We're just going to keep the names here, but if you did want to change those as well as the icons that those currently display here, if I go to the camera, I can change that. I can click on these this ellipse here and change it from, let's say, a camera for import to, oh, I don't know, any one of these. You can also import your own, but let's just change it to, this little share icon here. And there you go. You can see how that changes. So I'm just going to change it back just to keep things consistent. But again, if you wanted to swap those out with your own, that's how you do it. And that's contained in the menu folder, not your layout. As I said, there's lots of different views that are in our layout that are nested. But let's go back to our main activity here. And so when we click on that camera or that import, that we're going to want to create a fragment and then stick that fragment and its layout within the main screen. So again, when we click on this background content view will have whatever fragment that we define for this one. So let's go ahead and define our fragments. I'm going to right click on our package. And in this case, it's called .fragments is going to be our package name. But I'm going to go ahead and create a new package here. And that's just going to allow me to organize my code. I'm just going to type in fragments as a package name, and that's going to go under that because I right clicked on it. If I want to create a subfolder under fragments, I could do that all over again, but I want to create the new fragment within this fragments folder. So I'm going to right click on that again, go to new, and then I can go to Kotlin file/class and then create the fragment this way. But of course, Android Studio has an ability to do this automatically. So if we go to fragment, we can add a blank fragment. We can add a fragment with a list in it, and that'll generate a nice list view with several items in there, and you can do that. But we're going to go ahead and just create a blank fragment. And for this one, I'm going to call it, because we're clicking on that camera, and it is an import, just say import fragment. And let's go through these really quickly. Do I want to create a Layout XML? Yes, that's going to help me lay out my fragment that I need here, so make sure that box is checked. The next thing is going to be your fragment layout name. This usually just takes the name of your fragment and then reverses it so that everything is going to be called fragment and then whatever. And in case, because we have import fragment, it's not going to say import fragment again. So that just allows you to quickly alphabetically organize your file names, the layout, the fragment layout here, that'll be inside of your layout folder in a nice alphabetical. So all your fragments will be together because they all begin with F. So that's why they do that. And then the next one is include the fragment factory methods. This is going to allow you to create a fragment with several different parameters. We'll get into that in a second, but usually you want to have that checked. And then include interface callbacks. This is kind of handy if you want to be able to know when your fragment is being interacted with, but be notified back in your activity. I'm not a big user of this, but I'll show you what it is. And in case you want to use it, then you'll be able to, but at least you'll know what it is. And then finally, we'll make sure that we are using Kotlin because that's our current language that we're going to be using. I'm going to hit finish, and it's going to generate that fragment for me and a couple other things. And you can see that that new file goes under our fragments folder. What it also did is minimize my resources folder, because usually when Gradle rebuilds stuff, it tends to mess with this. So anyway, this is now our fragment import layout that we have. So it just says hello blank fragment. I'm going to go ahead and do that for, again, I'm going to do that for our other fragment that we want. So this one is going to be called gallery fragment. Right, type that in correctly. And again, we're going to keep all those options the same. It's going to go ahead and do that. And now I have our two fragments that we want to import. Now, as I mentioned, in our layouts folder, our fragments are going to live right next to each other because of the alphabetical naming of them. So gallery, instead of saying hello blank fragment, I'm going to double click on that and go down, just say this is our gallery fragment. So we'll see gallery fragment there. And then in our fragment import, we can do a number of things. Usually you do want to change those within the strings folder. So let's go ahead and do that. So under our values folder in our strings file, let's go ahead and change hello blank fragment to hello gallery fragment. And I'm going to change this to gallery. Double click on that, copy it, because we're going to go back to our gallery fragment. Instead of hard coding that value, what I'm going to do is do our @string value in here and find our, oh, I didn't save it, so let's go back to strings, save that one, go back to gallery, string / or I can just do this, click on the ellipse there and find it right there. Okay, so now it finally updated. Let's go ahead and hit OK. And now we're putting a dynamic string. And again, we can translate that. We talked about that in previous videos, but string, let's go ahead and copy this one. And instead of hello gallery fragment, we'll do hello import fragment and change the name of this one. Okay, so just doing it the proper way. Sometimes I skip over that to save time, but we'll make sure that we do that correctly. Okay, so now that we have these two fragments that we can now swap in and out of our main activity, we need to have the code in this handler here on this item, on navigation item selected, in order to take that fragment and then put it into that placeholder. So if we go to content main, so this contains just a text view here. I am going to actually take this out and I'm going to replace, I'm going to go to layouts here and I'm going to replace it with a frame layout. Now frame layouts, if you remember from previous videos, just allow us to put in one UI element that just takes up the entire frame. We can define the dimensions of it, but for this one, it's just going to take up the entire screen here. And we want to give it a name, so I'm just going to say container and copy that. Okay, so now that we have the ID for this container that lives in our content main, which we have the ability to get a handle to in our main activity. In other words, we can have our main activity now point to this object because we have an ID name for it. Let's go ahead and do that. So we're actually going to go up to the top for our onCreate. And under all this code that is boilerplate code for the template that we created, what we're going to do is actually create a variable to create those fragments, store those locally in the activity so we don't have to recreate them every time we click on the buttons. And I'm actually going to do that as a class variable. And these aren't going to get instantiated right away, so I'm going to do a late init var, and this one's going to be called gallery fragment, and that is going to be of type gallery fragment, of course. And we're going to do another late init var for the import fragment, so import fragment, and that is going to be, of course, of type import fragment. Okay, and because we're doing our late init, we don't have to set it equal to null or anything. And I am going to then copy that, paste it down here, just clean this up a little bit. And now we can instantiate our fragments in order to put those into our layout. So the first thing that we're going to do for that is just, because we created the factory functions, let's scroll down to see what those are. We have this companion object that gets attached to our class for, in this case, gallery fragment. Now, companion objects are kind of similar to static members or static class functions where you have the ability to have this object shared amongst all of your instantiations for this particular class. So in other words, this everything that lives inside of here gets shared across all of our instances of gallery fragment. So this is just a really nice way of creating new instances of gallery fragment. So if you look at new instance, it's going to ask for parameter 1, parameter 2. You can simply just delete those if you don't want them. So I'm going to delete those out of our gallery fragment, and I'm going to delete the puts for those because those are going to allow us to pass arguments to our fragment when it gets created. So we don't really need any of that stuff, so let's go ahead and delete that. I'm going to keep it in the other one just to show you the difference, but we'll go back to our main activity. And because those are companion objects, as I said, they are shared amongst the different classes, I can call gallery fragment as a class name, so all capitalized. Let's use the last one there, and then do dot new instance. Okay, so this is one way of doing a shared constructor along all those different fragments. And this one, we didn't need any parameters passed in here, but for the second one, we're going to call, this is capital import, and make sure we're using the class name, not the constructor, and new instance. And this one is going to ask us for 2 parameters. These parameters are just strings, so we can just do param1, and then as the second parameter, param2, and that will pass it to our instance of import fragment. So if you want to set up different parameters when those get created, if it's a Google map, for instance, you want to put in a latitude and longitude, you would do it in a very similar manner to this. Instead of strings, obviously, you'd use a lat long object, something like that. Okay, so once we have those 2 fragments as class members, we can now go in here, and because they're instantiated when this activity gets created, we can then put those into our container layout that we set up in our content main. So if you remember content main, under here we have a container. We're going to put in those fragments, and those fragments, again, if you remember, have different UI elements here. We can stick in anything we want: plain text, import text, or excuse me, edit text, as well as other whatever layout you want to put in here. Right now these are just text views, so no big deal, but you can get as complex as you want. In the interest of time, we'll just go ahead and assume you know how to do that. But if not, go look at the previous videos. All right, so fragments. Fragments, like activities, have a manager that manages how these get created and instantiated and put into our views and deallocated, etc. In our nav camera, we're going to take that import view, that fragment, and stick it in there. And so for this one, we're going to use the fragment manager. And because we're supporting an earlier version of Android, let's go to our import here. We're using the support library, as you can see, because I think in this one I selected using API level 15 and later. And so depending upon what version you're supporting, if you support maybe something a little bit higher, you might not have these same imports. But because we are using the support library, we're going to need to use the support fragment manager. So if you type in support and you don't see this, you're probably not using a support library. So there's that. But once we have the support fragment manager, this is the object that's going to allow us to put our fragment into these layouts and a couple other things which I'll show you. So once we have the reference to the fragment manager, we're going to hit enter on this because it's going to be multiple lines of code here just to keep it neat. But I'm going to begin this fragment transaction. We're going to start putting in this fragment into our layout, as I keep saying, but that's going to be part of this transaction series. So once we have begin transaction, everything that comes after it is going to kind of get queued up into this fragment manager system. And then once we commit those changes, which are going to be several in this case, that commit will then execute that function. So let's go ahead and just go through this. I'm going to replace a fragment, and in that, it's going to ask me for the container. So RID, and then the container is just called container. And then the next parameter it wants to know about is which fragment do you want to use. So in this case, I'm going to use the import fragment, and that's all we have to do for that. And so again, we're taking the import fragment, putting it into the container, using that replace. So whatever fragment's there, it's going to take it out, it's going to keep it in memory, but it's then going to replace it with this import fragment. Next one is add to backstack and add to backstack because that's the one we want to use. This will allow us to use the back button to undo that replace. So if I replace this import fragment or the whatever fragment we have currently on the screen, and then I tap gallery, it'll show the gallery screen. But if I wanted to go back to import fragment, I can hit our Android device's back button and it'll go back to here. And this is how we add this transaction to the back stack in order to accomplish that. So it's going to just ask for kind of an identifier for this. So I'm going to do import fragment dot toString just to give it kind of a name for that, or an ID, something that it can relate to. And then I'm going to set the transaction style for this. And this is going to be fragment transaction, if I can spell fragment, fragment transaction. And actually, I imported the wrong one. I always do that. So let's go back. So fragment transaction. If I spell this out, you can see that there's an Android.app version, and then there's an Android.support v4. This is the one that I want to use because if you remember, in our imports, I'm using the support library, and so these all have to match up. Otherwise, it'll give you an error for a mismatch type there. And it gave me a whole bunch of very definitive implicit package names for that class. So I'm going to actually go ahead and delete that and scroll up here and just make sure all my imports are correct. Yep, see, what it did is because I selected the wrong version, and this is a very common problem, especially when using the support library, sometimes you will import the wrong library, which I did here. So you always have to check and say, okay, this is not the support library fragment transaction, and so you can't use the fragment transaction, the normal one, with the support library fragment manager. So let's just go ahead and delete that. We'll go ahead and save it just so Android Studio knows what's going on. Now this will turn red because it doesn't know, it says unresolved reference, it doesn't know what class this is. Let's see, it'll come up, sometimes you have to type it in again, and this will bring up a little tooltip here. If you hit Alt-Enter, it'll import the library for you, but again, make sure that you're selecting the support one, which is selected here. So Android.support.v4, select that one, and of course we need to complete this. So the next one I'm going to do is transit underscore and then fragment. Alrighty, next, we're done. So we're going to commit that transaction, and that's going to replace whatever in container with import fragment, add it to our backstack. So I'm just going to copy, paste this under here, but the most important part is now we're going to use the gallery fragment. Then we're going to keep that same transaction there, or transition, excuse me. And we're pretty much done. So let me go ahead and launch this and see where we're at. All right, great. So this is our application. We removed the hello world from our container. If you want something to show up initially here, you'll have to, instead of using replace, you would add, but you might want to make sure that you only do that once, and you would do it in the onCreate. There was one thing that I forgot to implement, but I want to go and show you what this is, just in terms of this happens to you, because we did check that one box. I'll explain that in a second. If I hit this import, it will crash. Now, if we go down to our logcat, you can see that our main activity must implement onFragment interaction listener. Now you might be wondering what that is. If you go to the import fragment.kotlin file, you can see that it will throw a runtime exception with exactly that error. And so this is very kind of curious if you've never seen this before. So, all right, so scrolling up here, what this is going to do is we need to implement an onFragment interaction listener for this fragment. And this will give you the interaction between the fragment inside of the activity. So I'm just going to show you what that is, and then I'll explain it in a second. So scroll up here. You can see that our main activity is of type app.compat activity. And again, that's using our support library. And it's when we use a comma after this, this is going to use the, in this case, the navigation item selected, the interface for that, and then we implement this on navigation item selected. We need to do the same thing for our fragments. So if I go ahead and do a comma separated list here, I'm just going to put it under here because it's kind of messy. I can do import fragment dot on fragment interaction listener for that one. And then I also have to do one for the gallery fragment on fragment interaction listener. Okay, so I've told that this class, I've told Android Studio that this class is going to implement these two interfaces. Now I'm getting an error here because I haven't actually implemented those. I've just said I've implemented them and it's calling me out on that. So if you go down here and then you hit Control O for your overrides, you can do fragment, actually let me just type in fragment listener and scroll down a little bit more here. So we have this one here for our, if I scroll over our import, so I'm going to select that one. Okay, so that'll be our fragment interaction, and then this to do, we need to change. I'm going to simply just do a log D in here. On fragment interaction. Okay. All right, so then we can see when this gets called exactly in our interaction. So let's go ahead and hit play, rerun this emulator. All right, so now when I hit the hamburger menu and we have import here, you can see the hello import fragment. Next, we're going to go to the gallery and we have hello gallery fragment. So this is a great way to swap out different interfaces and different UI elements. We can also do this programmatically where we determine the layout and the device structure, whether it's a tablet or a phone, and have different pieces of UI. That's all I got for you guys. And if you like this video and you want to see more of this type, make sure you give it a thumbs up. If you think it'd be useful to somebody else, please share it. And if you want to see more videos from Electronic Armory, make sure you subscribe. We got videos on iOS development, Android development, 3D game development, and more. So we'll see you next time. Thanks.